When I first heard the Qur'an being recited, something in me woke up that I didn't know existed. The melody felt like a river moving through stone, shaping me from the inside. I didn't understand a single word, yet I felt understood. I remember pausing on the stairwell of a small community center, the sound floating up from a room below, and feeling for the first time in my life that I was not alone with my questions. I bought recordings of Sheikh Al-Husary and played them until the cassette hissed with wear. I traced the unfamiliar shapes of Arabic letters with my finger as if they were doorways to rooms I'd never entered before. I repeated the sounds slowly, shyly at first, then with a strange kind of hunger. I didn't have a teacher. I had no mentor. I had a cheap recorder, a mushaf I could barely decode, and a heart that kept leaning forward like a plant toward light. I learned Tajweed by rewinding the same line 10 times and practicing until my tongue softened and my breath knew where to pause. Each correct articulation felt like a key turning. I didn't enter Islam by announcement. I entered by listening. The listening grew into obedience, and the obedience bloomed into love. When I finally said the testimony of faith, it felt less like a change and more like a homecoming, the way the shore silently receives a returning tide. I told my parents that I had become Muslim. They were startled, of course. They asked the usual questions. Was I sure? Was this permanent? Was I being influenced by someone? I told them there wasn't someone, there was something, the pull of truth that had steadied my restless mind. I learned to pray by standing alone in my small room, a printout of transliteration crinkling on the carpet. My first sujood felt like placing my forehead where the earth remembers everything you forget. I cried without warning, not a dramatic cinematic cry, just a quiet loosening, as if the knots that had made it difficult to breathe had finally given way. My days began to organize themselves around the Adhan. I couldn't hear with my ears, but kept in my phone, a schedule of remembrance in a world of noise. A full year passed before I realized that hijab was not simply a cultural practice, but a command, a way of answering with my body what my heart had already said. The discovery came slowly, through study and questions and a tug that would not let me pretend I didn't know. I hesitated, not because I objected, but because I understood the cost. Faith had changed my inner world. Hijab would make that change visible to everyone else. The morning I decided to wear it, it was raining. The gentle, persistent rain that Londoners barely notice, but that soaks you all the same. I wrapped the scarf with trembling hands, half expecting the city itself to stop and stare. It didn't, but people did. The cashier's smile shrank a fraction. A classmate's conversation with me became careful, then brief. Another student tried to be supportive and ended up being awkward. On the train, reflections in the window caught me wearing my own courage, and I wasn't used to the sight of it yet. My parents found the hijab harder than my conversion. My mother traced the edge of the fabric with her fingertips and said softly, "I miss your hair." I told her I did too sometimes, the way you miss a childhood room. You love it, but you no longer live there. We had long conversations at the dining table that stretched into the night, about freedom and pressure, about autonomy and faith, about visibility and assumptions. She worried I would be misunderstood, targeted, boxed in. I told her I already had been, even without the scarf, just differently. At least now the box was of my choosing. At university, I was the only woman in my department who wore it. Strangely, the hardest resistance didn't always come from non-Muslims. It came from other Muslim women who had made different choices. Some were kind, but insistent. You don't have to. It's cultural. It's not in the Qur'an like you think. Others framed it as concern for my safety, or my future career, or my relationships. Their words stung because I respected them. But every time I tried to set down the obligation as if it were a heavy bag I could leave at the door, my conscience would not let me walk away. The loneliness of being visible pressed on me in small, relentless ways. A professor who had praised my work last term now seemed to withhold eye contact, as if speaking to me required a new vocabulary he hadn't learned. A stranger muttered as he passed me on the pavement. A group of students fell silent when I walked into the study lounge, then resumed in lower voices, as if kindness could be measured in decibels. I learned to distinguish curiosity from contempt, concern from condescension, and silence from peace. Whenever the pressure made my chest tight, I returned to the Qur'an, not as escape, but as calibration. I read verses about trials, and they read me back. You will surely be tested. That line settled me like a hand on the shoulder. Of course there would be tests. Of course there would be words that pricked and glances that cut. The text was not surprised by my life. It anticipated it. If you are patient and remain mindful, this was not passive endurance, but an active, deliberate anchoring. Patience, I learned, is the art of not surrendering your direction to the weather. I also read about covenants, about the trust of making truth clear and not concealing it to gain some small advantage. The verse felt uncomfortably specific, as if it had slipped into my bag unnoticed and waited for the moment I reached for a compromise. A small price is always ready to be paid. Anonymity, approval, the ease of blending in. I almost paid it more than once. Then I would remember the strange wealth that had entered my life the day I bowed my head and whispered words the world could not hear. Why exchange gold for glitter? Ramadan arrived, and with it a quiet revolution in my habits. Fasting introduced me to myself. The hours stretched and thinned until I could see through them, the way a curtain reveals a window when the sun shines directly behind it. Hunger sharpened my focus. Thirst tuned me to gratitude's frequency. I broke my fast with dates in the small kitchen of my flat, listening to recitation that felt like an old friend returning from a long journey. One night, I went to the mosque for Tarawih, heart pounding with the vulnerability of a new student. An old woman, her hands henna'd with delicate vines, smiled at me as if she had been expecting me for years. When we bowed together, I felt the weight of 1,000 anonymous kindnesses holding me up. Not every day was luminous. Some were heavy and gray. I remember a seminar where I presented research on sacred text and interpretation. During the Q&A, a student asked if my faith made me less objective. The room went still. I wanted to say that faith had made me more honest, not less. That it had rescued me from the pretense of neutrality and taught me to name my commitments without fear. Instead, I took a breath and spoke slowly about method and rigor and humility. Later, I wished I had said the other thing. But I also learned that truth comes in layers, and not every layer belongs in every room. My mother softened over time. She began asking me what the Qur'an said about patience, about mercy, about the mistakes we make and the hope we still somehow get to keep. We walked through a park carpeted in orange leaves, and she asked me why I stayed when it was hard. I told her that staying wasn't a stunt, it was a response. Once you have tasted a certain kind of peace, going back to the old hunger feels impossible. She didn't argue, she squeezed my hand. Sometimes understanding is not agreement, but the decision to love you where you are. The story people most wanted from me was the moment, the single decisive turn. But my life changed through 100 small obediences, choosing dawn over another hour of sleep, choosing truth over the relief of nodding along, choosing to stand out and then to stand firm, choosing to apologize when I was wrong and forgive when I wished I didn't have to. The Shahada was a doorway. The living of it was a hallway lined with daily doors. There were days when I asked God for an easier path and received instead a stronger spine. There were mornings when I wanted signs and received instead steadiness. I began to see that miracles often arrive disguised as ordinary consistency, the way rivers sculpt mountains, not through spectacle but persistence. Faith for me became less like a flame and more like a light that never quite goes out, even when the wind is busy. I am often asked whether I regret the hijab, whether I resent the stares or the missed opportunities that people imagine it causes. The truth is simpler and more demanding. Wearing it reminds me whom I'm trying to please. On the days I am tired, that reminder is mercy. On the days I am brave, it is celebration. On the days I am unsure, it is a hand on my back, guiding me forward. Modesty didn't make my world smaller. It made my interior life vast. I think of those early recordings, the careful cadence of Al-Husary measuring out syllables like pearls. I think of the verses that met me in my confusion and named it test, not failure. I think of the warnings about seeking praise for what we didn't do and how liberating it is to step out of that economy altogether. To build a life around God's nearness is to be free from 1,000 auditions you no longer have to give. I still walk past mirrored windows and catch sight of the woman I have become. Some days she looks braver than I feel. Some days she looks gentler than I expected. Most days, she looks like a person who has chosen again to live facing the one who sees her completely. I used to think faith would make me untouchable. It didn't. It made me reachable by mercy, by guidance, by the kind of responsibility that dignifies rather than crushes. If you ask me what I gained, I will tell you. A map that does not panic when the road bends, a language for gratitude that tastes like water after a long thirst, and a rhythm for living that keeps time with something eternal. If you ask me what I lost, I will say, the need to be approved by those who do not know my name in the morning or my prayers at night. I did not become less of myself. I became more honest about who that self is. And if you ask me whether I would choose it again, the listening, the obedience, the cloth on my head, and the covenant in my heart, I will smile. I already choose it every day.